Hey guys, this is Sebastian bringing you part one of a two-part series on 3-bet theory and ranges for RakebackDollars.com. In part one, we're going to take a look at some considerations for why we're going to be 3-betting, the different 3-bet ranges we're going to be looking at, and we're also going to be defining what hands to value 3-bet and what hands to bluff when we're defining those 3-bet ranges. In part two, we're going to take a look at some analysis of how 3-bet ranges changes versus different opponent types and how to adjust versus them. So versus the nit, the loose passive, and the reg, a value hand versus a loose passive may not be a value hand versus a nit, etc. We're also going to take a look at some positional stats to consider before 3-betting, such as what an opponent's fold to 3-bet is by position, possibly what the range is when they open from early position, and things of that nature. Before we can 3-bet, we need to ask ourselves a few questions. The basic question, obviously, is why am I 3-betting? Anytime we bet, we ask this, and anytime we bet, is it for value or is it as a bluff? If we're 3-betting for value, we have to ask ourselves, can the opponent call with worse, or can they bluff 4-bet us? So it doesn't make sense to 3-bet an opponent who really can't call, or it doesn't make sense to 3-bet them if there's no possibility that they'll 4-bet bluff you, or similarly, there's no point in 4-betting a hand as a bluff, or 3-betting a hand as a bluff if there's a high likelihood that a guy could 4-bet bluff you as well. If you're bluffing as a 3-bet, are you likely to get a fold versus the villain type that you're playing? That's very important. What position is he opening from? Typically from an earlier position. They're going to have a stronger range, which typically leads to them folding less, but again, that's not always the case. What's your table image, and what's your dynamic versus the villain? If you've been hammering on a villain and 3-betting him, and you guys have been playing back and forth versus each other, maybe sometimes that may be a good spot to take the foot off and to start value betting versus that opponent. Maybe not, but again, what dynamic do you have? Another question you want to ask is, before you 3-bet, what are you going to do if you get 4-bet? Typically, as a bluff, it's a pretty easy fold. If you have a value hand, typically you're going to want to get the money in. As a general rule, if you're 3-betting for value, you're going to want to get the money in. Again, there are rules, there are exceptions to the rule, but in general, that's a general rule. And what are your plans post-flop if you're called? So if you 3-bet and you're doing it as a bluff and you get called, what are your plans post-flop? Are you going to be firing barrels? Are you going to be firing barrels on certain textures? What's your bet sizing going to be? How much chips do you guys have behind? What are the pot to stack ratios going to be? Or for value, what flops are you going to be willing to get it in with? How are you going to be committed? And as always, am I in position or am I out of position? Now we're going to look at 3 different types of the 3 different 3-bet ranges. These are ranges that I think these are terms that a lot of players have heard, but they're really not familiar with. So we have the merge range, the polarized range, and the depolarized 3-betting range. This also, I think when we take a look at here, when we take a look at these ranges too, there's a lot of progression in poker that we can see. Around when I started playing online about 8 years ago, 9 years ago, recreationally, when back in the day, and when poker was starting at its infancy, I was mostly playing in sit and goes and buying into cash games and losing and wondering why guys always seemed to hit hands on me and got my big hands cracked when I was playing ultra tight. But that's a story for another day. So the merge range here is typically, again, when someone 3-bets and they're doing it with a value range. And then the next is the polarized range. When 3-betting started, people realized, they came to the conclusion, oh, people only 3-bet strong hands. If I start mixing in bluffs there, I can steal a lot of dead money and people aren't going to put up a lot of resistance. And then from the polarized range, it moved to the depolarized range, where people said, oh, okay, people are on to the fact that I could be stealing as a bluff, so I'm going to add medium strength hands into my 3-betting range so I can balance their range. So this is, again, this we can kind of see the progression of poker, just even in the three betting ranges. Okay, the merge range consists only of the villain's perceived top range. This is a value-based range. When I say perceived top range, the reason you have to say this is, again, different opponents perceive different hands as strong. Some guys only think ace king and aces and kings are strong hands, and the rest hands they're only flatting with. Some guys feel it's only aces. Some guys feel that tens all the way down to ace jack are really strong hands and that they should be three betting them. So again, a merged range is a villain's perceived top of their range that they're three betting for value. And again, a typical smaller micro stakes player, the range is going to consist of aces, kings, queens, and ace king. They're going to be three betting them for value. And again, sometimes ace, queen, and jacks, depending on how they, how strong they feel about them. We're going to be able to identify guys with merged three bet ranges that their three bet range is usually between 1 and 3.5%, depending on how tightly they three bet. Most of the students I coach or players I talk to, they have a merged range at the small and the micro stakes. One of the big reasons is because they don't know what hands they should be bluffing and what hands they shouldn't be bluffing, and they don't know in what situations against what types of opponents they should be doing it against. And also they say, oh, whenever I three bet light, I always get called, or I get four bet, or I get called, and then I'm playing a hand post flop, and I get myself into tricky situations. So for those reasons, I think playing a merged range is actually the most optimal at 25 no limit and below. I think that for some of the reasons that I stated already, that one, you're going to get into a lot less trouble by only three betting your value hands and creating big pots. Typically, if you're playing the micro stakes games, you're more of a beginning player, or so maybe your game isn't as developed, and so you're really not going to be you're going to be wanting to avoid putting yourself in as tricky spots as possible, and bloating big pots with marginal hands is definitely a way to get yourself into trouble. Another really important reason why I think three betting a merged range at the micro stakes is, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in the depolarized range as well, is the fact that at small and micro stakes especially, the biggest mistake most players make is that they call too much. So if players call too much, we want to be building big pots with big hands and not bloating pots with marginal hands, so we can be getting into a lot of situations where we're building big pots where we have a dominating hand. So, that's another reason why we're going to be wanting to three bet strong hands. And also, and lastly too, for beating the micro stakes, we don't need to get super tricky. Playing a good value-based game where you play good solid poker is going to do it. And again, building big pots with good hands and making good folds early is what's going to win. So you're going to be playing with a much larger player pool at the micro stakes games, so it's not like you're going to be playing with the same players day in and day out. Also, if you are playing with some of the same guys, repeatedly, if they were really adjusting well and really able to exploit the leaks that you'd have, they probably would have moved up from 25 NL at this point as well too. So you really don't have to worry about getting exploited nearly as much. And again, it's just going to make your decision process easier, and the less difficult spots that you put yourself in, especially when you're either a new player or looking to get better, become a winning player where you are, giving yourself, and really no matter what stakes you play or whatever, the less difficult spots and positions that you put yourself in, the less possibility you give yourself to make a big mistake. Next, we're going to take a look at the polarized range. In the polarized range, the villain continues to 3-bet the top of their range, but they'll also mix in the bottom of their range as bluffs in order to balance their range. Hence, polarized. They either have a monster or trash. So, when we talk about polarized, sometimes we think of like polarizing figures. Last year Tim Tebow was the picture of a polarizing figure. Either loved him or hate him. So it's the top and the bottom. It's the two opposite sides of the spectrum. The range is the same. The value range is typically the same as the merged range, but it also mixes in the trash hands. The range will approximately look like a 4 to 9% 3-bet range. It's going to differ depending on how tightly they 3-bet. It's also going to differ whether you play full ring or whether you play 6 max. At 6 max, the 3-bet ranges are typically going to be much wider. Okay, the last range we're going to look at here is the depolarized range. The villain continues to 3-bet the top and bottom of the range, but they'll also mix in medium strength hands. In today's games, these medium strength hands are typically used as the bluff part of villains 3-bet. This is superior to the polarized 3-bet range because when we do in fact get called, we have a much better chance of either having the best hand or making the best hand, as opposed to when we 3-bet trash. So this 3-bet becomes a semi-bluff, though they still take advantage of 3-betting any two cards when the situation is right. So basically, again, when the games were progressing, people found out, I can 3-bet very wide and I can take advantage because people fold too much. Well, people started counteracting that by flatting and then, 4-betting and, we all know 5-betting and now and has become in vogue and, is popular. So there are counters to that. The way they balanced it was by mixing in their medium strength hands, again, giving them an opportunity to still make the best hand. So it's, in essence, semi-bluffing, with your 3-bet. The typical medium strength hand that will be best to be 3-betting here is the one that's just below good enough to be call, and it'll widen and narrow depending on who's opening and how you're playing against that villain. I know it sounds complicated, but let me explain. So for instance, if we call with ace-10 suited, let's say ace-10 suited is the last suited ace that we would call, but we'd fold ace-9 suited because it's just not quite good enough to call with. Then 8-9 suited becomes the first hand that we would 3-bet as a bluff. And then depending on how wide we are 3-betting versus a villain, so depending on how, if they're folding very often to 3-bets, we're going to be 3-betting them wider. If they're not 3-betting as wide, we're going to be 3-betting them narrower. So we'd widen our bluff range, and the way we determine what hands we 3-bet, we'd start with ace-9, then move down to ace-8, ace-7, ace-6, etc. If we were 3-betting them extremely wide, that could go all the way down to ace-2 suited that we would be 3-betting them with in that situation. If we were 3-betting them mostly for value but mixing in a good bluff here and there, maybe we'd only be mixing in ace-9 suited and maybe ace-8 suited. Again, that depends on the villain type who is opening. Other examples would include, let's say you'd call in position with king-queen suited, but you'd fold king-queen off. King-queen off would be the first hand that you would 3-bet as a bluff with, and then you'd expand there to king-jack off, king-10 off. Similarly, calling with jack-10 suited, but 3-betting jack-9 suited. Calling with pocket sixes. If pocket sixes is the last pocket pair that you cold call in position with, then you'd start 3-betting pocket fives. Typically, when the same players have been playing with each other every day, it's standard for players to also 3-bet medium strength hands that in most situations would be better to flat. So maybe they will 3-bet ace-10 suited or even pocket 10s, 8-9 suited, ace-jack suited as a way of balancing. At the small and micro stakes games, this is 100% not necessary, and I don't recommend doing it. At the higher stakes games where guys do it more just to, again, to balance, to really let those players know, hey, I'm capable of 3-betting in this spot with this hand, so they can't, it makes their range harder to define. Again, we don't really need to be doing that at the small and micro stakes limits at all. Even going back to what I was talking about when we were talking about the merged range at 25 NL, I recommend only 3-betting a merged range. You can get away with doing only 3-betting a merged range, even at 50 and 100 NL in today's games, I think. I think it's not going to be optimal, and I think that especially if you're playing on a small site such as Merge here with a lot of regulars, they're going to be able to pick up on that very quickly and it'll be very exploitable. But I think if your game is very strong in other areas, that it's definitely something that, you know, it's not going to kill you. Again, it's much better to only be 3-betting for value than it is to be 3-betting way too much as a bluff and just spewing money. So again, but again, I don't advocate at 50 or 100 NL just using a merged range. I think you need to start to open it up a little bit more. As a general rule for small microstakes players, when 3-betting a depolarized range, I recommend using the suited high card hands as my bluffs. They have the best chance of improving post-flop, plus they have high card value that if you hit, you may make the best hand. Also, by playing high cards, it lessens the possibility that the villain has a large pocket pair or premium hand due to card removal effect. So if you have ace-king, or if you have ace-9 suited and you're 3-betting, we'll use the ace-9 again, it's less likely that the opponent has ace-king or that they have even pocket aces, you know, again, the premium hands. Like we talked about before, lastly, the biggest mistake most small microstakes players make is that they call too much. So you may 3-bet ace-9 suited and get called by small pocket pairs that you're in a coin flip with and are extremely hard to play post-flop. Or even get called by a hand you are dominating like ace-5 suited. In that last example I mentioned, another reason why I don't like 3-betting small pocket pairs as a 3-bet bluff. It's very hard for those hands to improve on the flop, and there's virtually no good flops that you're going to see. You're bloating a huge pot in a spot that you're going to see a flop that you're never going to like. There's always going to be at least 2 overcards, and if there aren't 2 overcards and someone's willing to put money in, are they really doing it with pocket fives? And do you really want to spew off? Do you really want to stack off with pocket fives by firing multiple barrels again when your hand has very little chance of improving and they already called your 3-bet, which means they have something, and they already called your flop bet? So again, I'm not a big fan of 3-betting small pocket pairs as bluffs. Also, just using the ace-9 hand as an example, still using on that, even if you get called by a hand like kings or queens or jacks, you can flop an ace and make the best hand. Now, when I do that in that situation, I'm never looking to get the money in because worse hands aren't going to get the money in, but you can always, I'm looking to get 1 to 2 small streets of value if I hit in that particular spot. Just like the polarized 3-better, the depolarized 3-better range is going to be approximately between 4 and 9%, depending on how tightly they 3-bet. Again, wider at 6 max, less wide at full ring. Here's just a comparison of all the ranges side by side. Again, the merged range, only 3-bets for value. The typical ranges, the premium hands, aces through queens, ace king, sometimes ace queen, and jacks. The polarized range, they're 3-betting the top of their range for value, and then just trash hands as bluffs when they think it's a good opportunity to take hands away. And then the depolarized range is playing the most balanced of the 3-bet ranges by value betting the top of their range and their medium strength hands for the most part of their bluffs, but again, they'll still use the trash hands sometimes to bluff with here. And when I say the most balanced, I don't think we need to, in most cases, be worried about at the small and micro stakes, having a balanced 3-bet range, because again, I don't think most players are going to be able to exploit it, but it's good to be able to understand the different types of ranges, and I think that it's good to understand good situations that it would be to bluff. But again, there's not a huge well, let me put at 25 and NL and below, there's no need for it, and at 50 and 100, you really need to start learning how to do it if you want to become profitable, very profitable, and really succeed and take your, continue to move up in the games. So that's going to do it for this video, but stay tuned for part 2. Again, we're going to be taking a look at how 3-bet ranges change versus different opponent types, and how to adjust versus the 3 standards: the nit, the loose passive, and the reg, and how to, very importantly, widen and narrow our bluff and value range against those particular opponents. Again, I can't stress the importance of this really anymore. In one of my previous videos, I talked about the difference between static and dynamic ranges. Dynamic ranges are flexible and adjust depending on the opponent type, and static ranges are always the same. So, for instance, someone always only 3-bets aces, kings, and queens. They always do it for value. Where somebody who has a dynamic 3-bet range against players who are calling too wide, they'll widen their 3-bet range for value. So maybe they'll include jacks, ace king, and ace queen, where they'll narrow their bluffing range because they know the player calls too much. And again, that's really one of the most important skills of 3-betting. And then again, we're going to take a look at positional stats and some of the some of the positional stats to consider before we're going to be 3-betting versus different opponent types. So looking forward to getting that to you, and I hope this helps. And like always, post any questions and I'll answer them. This is Sebastian for RakebackDollars.com.